The head of neurology called her into his office at noon, and the hospital corridor felt like the inside of a held breath. Fluorescent lights humming, shoes soft on linoleum, the smell of antiseptic, and the faint sweetness of someone's vanilla hand cream. Dr. Harris sat behind a desk stacked with folders as if he were a man who preferred problems on paper. When he looked up, his eyes measured her the way a tide measures a shoreline, careful, even, searching. "Ms. Monroe," he said, voice quiet but not unfriendly, "we need to speak about the Carter case, and about you." She kept her hands folded in front of her. Nurses didn't flinch easily. They were used to late nights and sharp things. But the name, the billionaire's name, still made the air feel heavier. Grant Carter's crash had been everywhere. Late-night speculation, pundits muttering, headlines that called him untouchable one day and a ghost the next. Anna had learned to see him as a man in a bed, not a headline, not a fortune, a person. "You're being assigned to his private suite," Dr. Harris said. "Full time. It'll be intensive." "I know what the job is," she replied. She did. She knew the schedules, the charts, the endless small mercies, rinsing a mouth, turning a shoulder, singing soft nonsense into a patient's ear because silence felt too large. He steepled his fingers. "We've seen steady, faint responses, reflexes, slight cortical activity on repeated EEGs, nothing definitive. But the family, the administration, they want someone who treats him more than they treat a case file. That's why I want you." Her chest tightened, not because of fear, because the offer carried a weight she hadn't expected to hold: trust. Small, quiet acts of trust had guided her nursing career more than accolades ever could. She shouldered it with the only steady thing she had, a steady hand. Then Dr. Harris did something ordinary and precise. He leaned forward, set his wrist over the thin pulse at the inside of Anna's arm, and checked her pulse as if confirming that her own heart beat steady under the white of her sleeve. She felt the touch, warm and clinical, and then, like a soft blow that didn't bruise, something else arrived. Not a revelation, not a thought that announced itself in bold. A small, impossible hum under her ribs, the kind of feeling that lived like a loose thread you only noticed when you tugged on it. It startled her. She hid it behind a professional nod. "I'll do my best," she said. Dr. Harris lifted his gaze and for a beat looked at her differently. There was no flirtation in his expression, only the clear, cool recognition of someone who had just chosen a difficult thing and would have to be counted on. He released his wrist and slid a folder across to her with a set of initials written in a steady hand. G.C. "You'll meet him this afternoon," he said. "We'll do a full briefing. I'll expect daily reports. Ms. Monroe, Anna, we need more than procedure. We need someone who speaks to the person who's here, even if he can't answer." She left his office with the folder pressed to her chest, the corridor opening like a river after the dam of that small, startling feeling. The city outside the hospital windows was a pale bar of glass and concrete, indifferent. But inside, the unit held a rhythm she could tune to. The soft beeping of monitors, the rounded exhale of machines, the smell of warm linen. She thought of the private suite waiting for her, of the single bed flanked by flowers that seemed both cheap and deliberate, of the large windows that looked out over the skyline, where the river caught the afternoon and sent it glittering into the glass. If this is moving you, tap like to see more stories about quiet courage. She arrived at the suite the way a gardener arrives at a plant that needs tending, not expecting miracles, but believing in steady care. Grant Carter lay under a light blanket, his jaw relaxed, face at once severe and young. The monitors traced a calm, irregular line, his heart steady, his breathing mechanical and even. Machines made the room honest. Anna's first actions were simple and unceremonious. She smoothed a damp towel over his forehead, the cloth worn from the sink, and adjusted the pillow so his neck didn't kink. Her hands moved without fanfare, practiced and gentle. She checked the corners of his eyes for dryness, dabbed a little moisturized cream on cracked lips, massaged the tensed muscles of his forearm to keep circulation moving. She talked to him like a friend, recounting nothing special. The scent of the rain earlier, the small scandal of a television soap opera she pretended to admire, the way the plant on the sill had been saved from a colleague's careless neglect. He had been like this for months, unmoving, almost effortless in his stillness, the world outside folding in and out of his life. Visitors were brief and brittle. Aides came and went with charts that smelled of printer ink and protocol. But Anna carried with her a different currency. She had learned in nursing school that time, in the form of attention, could be enough to keep someone from unraveling. She sat at his bedside not to watch over him, but to be there when he dipped back toward the surface. Small things began to ripple. A finger that once lay limp on the sheet twitched one morning as she buttoned the cuff of his pajama sleeve. A breath would hitch like a prisoner of dust in a shaft of sunlight. At night, when the suite was dim and the city beyond the windows went from blue to black to gold, she would sing, not because she thought it was therapy, but because the cadence of a human voice in the dark is a kind of tether. Dr. Harris sent orderlies and specialists through the suite in rounds that smelled of coffee and clinical purpose. EEGs were scheduled at odd hours, blood tests siphoned. The staff spoke carefully about progress, as if the word itself were a fragile vase they might drop. They cautioned Anna with the same professional tenderness they gave fragile plants. Hope, controlled. She learned the language of conditional verbs, could, might, showed, words that kept miracles at a respectful distance. Still, evidence kept whispering back at them. The EEGs, watched by half a dozen faces in a control room, showed intermittent bursts of activity, tiny flickers everyone called sparks. Dr. Harris would stare at the monitor and say nothing, the way people do when the news is both promising and dangerous. A physical therapist began to coax reflexes, gently moving limbs, testing for withdrawal. Grant's fingertips would flex reflexively around her hands, like a child who suddenly remembers how to hold a toy. The telemetry would blip, quiet as a moth. Those signs were small enough to keep the world from changing and big enough to change Anna. She took those sparks personally, as if the faintest uptick on a screen were a note someone had left in the margin of a book. She kept a notebook at her bedside, times, observations, last interactions before a nap. She wrote with the sort of meticulousness nurses pick up in their bones, a way to record mercy. On an evening, light had thinned to silver, and the monitor beeps had a patience to them. Something else happened. She was wiping his chest with a warm cloth, following the small map of his body she had memorized. The slope of a shoulder, the hollow beneath a collarbone, the rhythm of breaths that she matched with hers like an anchor. The suite's window showed a slice of the skyline, and the moon was a pale coin. As she lifted her hand to his wrist, his fingers tightened around her thumb. Not a reflex, not a handful of grasping muscle, but a conscious squeeze, as if someone had finally remembered the existence of their own limbs. The sound of the monitor spiked and then settled into sharp staccato, as if someone had set a metronome to the tempo of panic. Lights flooded the room. Dr. Harris was there in a pulse, white coat fluttering, orders spoken in short commands that were sharp and professional. Nurses moved, machines adjusted. The team executed what they had rehearsed 1,000 times in the simulated sterile of training rooms. Yet through it all, in the noisy urgency, Anna and the man in the bed found a private, absurdly personal moment. Their eyes met. He looked at her with an expression that cut through the fog of months like a pane of clear glass. He recognized her, or he felt her. He made a sound, more breath than word, but it had weight. When the doctors leaned in, he whispered a name that belonged to no headline and no public scandal. He murmured, with all the fragile intention of someone relearning speech, "Anna." Everything in Anna went very quiet then, as if the world had folded in on itself to make a small, precise space for that syllable. In the drills and the beeping and the practiced motions, something human had leaked through. She wasn't a nurse who had done this job 1,000 times. She was the person the sound had reached. Her hands were still in his grasp. The warmth from his palm pooled into her skin like a small private currency. Consent is not a switch. It crept up in pieces. A blink that meant awareness, a squeezing of the hand that meant recognition, a name like a hook thrown across water. The medical team responded with the rigorous calm of professionals. They ran scans, they reassured, they monitored. Dr. Harris's expression was cautious euphoria. He spoke into the phone in clipped tones about protocol. There were more tests in the morning. For now, there was the extraordinary and intimate fact. He had looked at her and said her name. Recovery, once it starts, is stubbornly patient. It doesn't follow the clean narrative a movie promises. Instead, it works in small, tactile moments. Grant's eyes tracked the ceiling fan slowly for a day, and then later followed the outline of the skyline. He began to focus on the silhouette of her hand when she fed him a spoonful of soup. He remembered things, snatches at first, a laugh, a face, the name of a dog that didn't belong to him. He disliked the taste of hospital coffee. He detested suits that felt like armor. He liked the way the light hit the river at 5 in the afternoon. Anna became both witness and translator to his dawning consciousness. She read his micro-expressions the way a conductor reads the score. A narrowing of the eyes, a half lift of the lip. He had moments of lucidity that were startling, and others where he would stare at the wallpaper as if it were a map of a foreign country. Therapists came in, patient and precise, coaxing his speech, his motor skills, his patience with missing pieces. The physiotherapist taught him to hold a cup. The occupational therapist made him practice buttoning a shirt. Every small success felt as if the world had been stitched tenderly back together. At night, when she sat beside him and the city outside the windows folded into night, she allowed herself to imagine the life that had been paused. Boardrooms with glass walls, flights in private jets, a man used to launching things into motion with a word and a signature. It was easy to see the contours of his previous life, power that made things acquiesce. It was harder to reconcile that with the man who now hesitated over where to place his fork. It was in the quiet spaces between therapy and tests that memory began to flicker for him. At first, the flashes were impressionistic, a crunch of metal, the smell of hot rubber, a blur of headlights. He would close his eyes and there would be the sensation of braking, sudden, frantic, followed by a roll of glass and then black. Those fragments were like photographs that missed the frame, edges burned out, crucial pieces lost. Anna listened to these half-remembered dreams as if they were confessions. She would sit on the edge of the bed and hold his hand while he traced the night like someone tracing an old map, his fingers landing on landmarks he couldn't name. He would murmur about the wheel fighting to turn, a squeal of rubber, a flash of a figure slipping away into shadows. Sometimes he would become agitated, the muscles in his jaw working as he tried to drag language up through the fog. Other times he would go still, exhausted by the reach. When he mentioned breaks, she filed it neatly as a sign for the neurologists, another clue to the trauma in his head. But the human part of her attended to it differently. She crouched in the small, private place a nurse learns to claim, and she let her curiosity breathe. People who lived in wealth did not have secrets like others. They had a way of making secrets into transactions. She wondered, not yet accusing, whether the crash had been an accident. Hospital security files are not meant for bedside nurses, but tasks bled into each other. As he fought to find the word for wheel, Anna would help him navigate his phone, scrolling through pictures of past events, prodding him with gentle questions. One night, while he rested and the city coughed neon into the tall windows, she pinned open an app to show him photos from a gala months before the crash. He squinted at the thumbnail images, then paused at one that showed a hand on a steering wheel, a blur of movement that had seemed so normal and so familiar when he'd snapped it. A notification blinked in the corner, a bank statement linked to an account that had been set up to manage his more private expenses. She tapped it open on his tablet to help him recognize a name, and something in the transaction history pinned her like a prick of cold. There was a transfer, large enough to be conspicuous, to a business with the initials NC. The transaction was flagged with a terse description, security deposit, retainer. The dates lined up oddly with the night of the crash. She closed the tablet with a reflexive flick, guilty for peeking where she shouldn't have, but curiosity had already opened a door. She was a nurse, not a detective. She knew the boundaries of her job the way she knew the cadence of a good compression. But nurses were people too, which meant that sometimes compassion bled into protectiveness. It took very little for protectiveness to tip into suspicion. A secret transfer at a suspicious hour, a half-formed memory about brakes failing, the knowledge that someone close to the family had known how to move money quietly. Her instincts hummed like a low instrument in her chest. She checked the hospital's incident files when protocol allowed and made a mental note to mention her concern to Dr. Harris in morning rounds. She didn't want to be mistaken for a melodramatic nurse seeking a daytime soap, but the evidence had its own gravity. Brakes tampered with were not the same as human error. A transfer under the name NC suggested intention. It was a syllable that fit too neatly into the puzzle to ignore. At the same time, Grant's recovery accelerated in ways that were almost indecent in their speed. A button fastened, a sentence completed, the way his laugh returned like a half-forgotten tune. He began to speak to her not as an object of care, but as someone to whom he was accountable. He asked questions, not about his wealth, not at first, but about the smallest of things. He wanted to know how she liked her coffee. He asked if she was sleeping. He wanted to know about the plant on the windowsill. There were moments when he would look at her as if cataloging her, as if the sight of her was something he was trying to keep for himself in case the world tried to take it back. He learned to hold a spoon without shaking. He relearned how to make an appointment. He reached out to touch her forearm casually in operations where the movement was simply human. The first time he spoke without the strain of recovery and said, "Thank you," the words felt inadequate. She told him it was fine. In the way people do, when paper and gratitude are not enough, he tried again with a different grammar. "You were my light in the dark," he told her once, voice low and a little embarrassed. He wasn't joking, and the confession hit the room like night settling on a field. Every human interaction carried 1,000 tiny ethical bristles. Anna navigated them with the deliberate caution of someone who had worked long nights and seen what boundary erosion could become. She reminded herself repeatedly that he was a patient. She recorded each improvement in the charts. She answered his questions without overpromising and refused certain conversations that slipped into intimacy while he was still fragile. Love, she believed, could wait for consent to be whole. At the center of the recovery, Dr. Harris kept a steady, watchful hand on the medical side of everything. He briefed the family, terse, controlled updates, and the administration danced a careful shuffle around privacy and press control. When Grant's memory returned in shards, they were careful to document them. That documentation would be what could transform suspicion into a worthy case. But documentation is slow, like weather. The world's justice wheels turn clumsily compared to the neat snap of a careless hand completing a wire transfer. Discovery required a different kind of patient persistence. Anna found herself holding two lists, one of recovery goals and one of small oddities that didn't belong. She was keeping both because she trusted the rhythm of informed persistence more than the sudden catharsis of accusation. The hospital had its own quiet politics. Nathan Carter's name came up in those circled conversations, a half-brother with a history that tasted like undercurrents, jealous boardroom maneuvers, a public rivalry sharpened by press releases, a closeness to money and to the family's tangled trust. The press had been cruelest about him, painting him in lines that were too simple. But real people are seldom simple, and the hospital was a place where simplicity died quickly, replaced by the complicated truth of care. One night, after a therapy session that had left Grant exhausted in a way that made him hiccup into sleep, Anna sat in the dim light and reopened the tablet. She justified it with kindness. He was trying to reconnect with his life, and she was his proxy in the small acts that made a man feel known. The bank app was easy enough to navigate. The transactions were a neat parade of numbers and names. There it was, a transfer dated within days of the crash, a large debit to NC Holdings with a routing note that was curiously bland. Vehicle maintenance. She read it 3 times. Someone had labeled a payoff to look mundane. The amount was not casual. She scrolled further and found other entries, an invoice to a local mechanic, an unexplained hush of funds moving through channels that smelled wrong when placed beside the timeline of the crash. She put the tablet down and stared at the window. Outside, the river was a line of black glass with small teeth of light. Inside, the monitor beeped in steady compassion. Her reflection in the glass was a face she'd known for years, efficient, kind, and suddenly anxious. She could have closed the file and left the questions to lawyers. She could have gone home and tried to unlearn the suspicion she had just borne. Instead, she breathed in and made a new list, one that would require patience and courage in equal measure. She would, first thing in the morning, mention the financial irregularity to Dr. Harris. She would ask for an official review of the crash files. If the tampering hinted by Grant's memory held true, the evidence would need to be handled with precision. She had seen how the missteps of amateurs could ruin legitimate claims. She had also seen how silence could bury truth. There was a knock at the door before dawn. The hospital's corridors have an hour that feels like belonging to nobody and everybody at once. The late worker, the early surgeon, the exhausted parent. Anna opened it to a young detective from the city, sharp-eyed and careful, who said his name and that he'd been assigned to follow up on an anonymous tip related to an accident investigation. He had questions. He had credentials. He was a person in a room who wanted the truth as badly as she did. When she opened her mouth to speak, gentle phrasing, cautious, weary, Grant stirred in the bed, and for a moment the room held its breath. He blinked, looked directly at Anna, and the small, impossible hum under her ribs from the day Dr. Harris had checked her pulse rose like an echo. It was not yet named. It was not yet a story. But it had momentum. The detective's questions skimmed surfaces. Who had been with him close to the night of the accident? Who had access to his vehicles? Had there been any threats? As the detective spoke, Anna's eyes angled to the window where the skyline was a line of promises and mistakes. She remembered the transfer on the tablet and the image of a shadow slipping away. She thought of Nathan's name and the way envy can calcify into something cruel. She could tell the detective everything she had seen, everything she suspected. She could tell him about the squeeze of his fingers and the way he'd said her name. She could tell him about the transfer and watch as the things she'd noticed folded into the larger world. If she told the truth, she would set wheels in motion she could not stop. If she kept silent, she would hold the secret like a hot coal. She put a hand over Grant's and felt the warmth of his skin beneath hers. The beeping of the monitor kept time with a city that had decided for now not to break into catastrophe. Outside, dawn was a pale smear. Inside, the room was a pool of quiet urgency, and Anna had to decide what the next step would be. She opened her mouth. She would tell the detective about the transfer. She would be careful with words. She would protect the patient. She would protect the truth. When the sentence left her, it was simple and small, the sort of thing that gathers momentum like water finding a channel. There was a transfer, she said, to an NC Holdings account. The dates line up. I don't want to accuse anyone, but... The detective's face, for a half-second, held the expression of a man who has been handed the beginning of a case. The monitor kept beeping. The city skyline outside the window turned lighter. Grant's hand gave a faint, involuntary flex under her fingers, the kind that meant more than reflex. And underneath her ribs, the hum she'd first felt in Dr. Harris's office thrummed like the first chord of a song she didn't yet know the name of. The detective's pen paused, then moved, a small, decisive scrawl that set the room in motion. He asked for the tablet again, for dates, for names. Anna answered as carefully as she could. Facts first. Feelings kept to the edges where they couldn't be mistaken for evidence. She told him about the transfer, the date, the notation that made no sense, the way the thumbnail image of a hand on a wheel had caught Grant's eyes. She told him about the squeeze of his fingers and the syllable of her name that had reorganized the room. When she finished, the detective looked at her, not like a man trying to pry at a secret, but like someone with a long, patient hunger for truth. "We'll take it from here," he said. "And, Miss Monroe, Anna, I might call on you again." The call came sooner than she expected. Within 48 hours, officers with a warrant swept into the garage where Grant's car had been stored. The hospital team cooperated. Dr. Harris supplied the crash reports and coordinated with legal counsel. It all felt like a complicated choreography in which Anna had been handed a cue she didn't know how to dance. She watched from the small window of the suite as professionals in gloves pried into the hushed metal of that night, their headlamps throwing long shadows over torn carpet and a wheel rim like something fossilized. An accident reconstruction team worked with quiet intensity. They took photographs, they unrolled technical diagrams, they spoke in the clear, deliberate grammar of people who had turned chaos into a craft. Anna learned the language of tampering slowly. Cuts that didn't follow the pattern of impact, thread that was fresh among the rust, a caliper mark that didn't belong. It was the sort of detail that becomes overwhelming until someone translates it into a story of intent. The mechanic who inspected the vehicle for the police was a thin man with grease beneath his fingernails and an expression that folded into worry as he described what he'd found. The brake lines had been tampered with, small clamps used to restrict flow, a section repaired in a way a mechanic doing emergency service on a roadside might never choose. The technician's voice wavered only when he said the word deliberate. "That's not something that happens in a bad storm or because of old parts," he told the detective. "Someone did that on purpose." Money has the strange ability to make things tidy. A transfer that looks like a retainer on a spreadsheet becomes a thread, a line that can be followed. Investigators traced the NC Holdings deposit with the quiet patience of auditors. The transfer ran through layers of shell accounts meant to diffuse attention. There were intermediaries, a local mechanic's invoice paid out of sequence, and a private company with connections to the Carter family's inner circle. The legal team clipped papers together and marked them in the orderly way that turned suspicion into probable cause. Nathan Carter's name surfaced as they had feared, but the way it arrived carried less of the sensationalism of gossip and more the cold geometry of motive. Board minutes revealed friction. An email chain exposed late-night threats thinly veiled as pressure to resolve family matters. And a dinner receipt showed a meal where Nathan had been alone with the mechanic who later admitted to doing odd jobs without keeping the neatest records. Investigators dug through phone metadata and found calls that lined up with the transfers. It was the kind of mapping that, in movies, seems too neat. In reality, it was slow and unromantic. Files, interviews, subpoenas. When the evidence coalesced into a warrant and a plan to confront Nathan, the hospital felt like a border between two worlds. Grant lay in the suite, eyes closed, the rhythm of the monitor a steady metronome that had come to mark safety. Anna sat at the foot of the bed, hands folded in her lap, feeling like the hinge on a door that might yet swing one way or another. Grant woke that morning with a look of a man who had dreamt his past and woken into the present. He peered at her with a curiosity that suddenly made him seem younger, as if the trauma had stolen decades from his stare and then handed them back at once. "Where are we?" he asked. "In the hospital," she said gently. "You're safe. They're looking into what happened to your car." He exhaled, the sound a tiny, controlled surrender. "The brakes." "We're finding answers," Anna assured him. She didn't tell him the full weight of what they had already discovered. He didn't need to carry the evidence. His job was to heal, not to prosecute. But he listened, and when she spoke, his fingers found hers, squeezing with a steadiness no medication could give. When the police moved to bring Nathan in for questioning, the press lingered outside hospital gates like vultures in neat suits. The family's public relations team tried to contain the narrative, but the facts had their own gravity. An arrest was carried out with procedural care. Officers in plainclothes took Nathan from his penthouse with cuffs that were more ceremonial than corrective. A man still dressed as if for a board meeting, his face a portrait of someone who had believed control meant the right to shape events unseen. Nathan's declaration of innocence was loud enough to ricochet through news cycles, a practiced declamation of shock and betrayal. The truth, however, is quieter. In interrogation rooms, behind closed doors, the evidence has a way of speaking for itself. The mechanic, confronted with documents and the realization of the gravity of his actions, testified about the clumsy repair and the cash that had made the work seem like a favor rather than a crime. Bank records mapped a route of funds that ended at a company tied to Nathan's operations. Under the steady pressure of questions and the inevitability of proved connections, the story that Nathan had tried to make simple, an unfortunate series of events, found itself a shape that could be named. Anna watched the proceedings from the small, contained distance a hospital allowed. Her role was not to be a witness in court theatrics, though she did give a statement, calm and true, about the transfer she'd found and about Grant's recollections. Her voice did not tremble. It conveyed the nurse's careful cataloging rather than melodrama. She did not stand in the spotlight. That was not her way. But in a legal sense, the things she had observed, her notes, the tablet screenshot, the recorded times of the slight responses, became threads the detective wove into the larger tapestry of the case. When Nathan was indicted, the relief in the suite was not cinematic so much as domestic. A new routine took hold that felt less like a Band-Aid and more like stitches knitting skin together. Grant's recovery, which had accelerated into something almost disrespectful of the statistics, continued with its modest apprenticeship, physical therapy, speech exercises, the slow tyranny of repetition. The public interest shimmered and then receded, a headline or two, then a focus shift to other dramas. In the unglamorous world where healing lived, Anna continued her small, steady ministrations. There were afternoons when Grant would go outside to sit on the suite's balcony with the city under his feet, the river a line of light that had not altered with his absence. He'd watch barges pass and sometimes speak, haltingly, about the trivialities that became presents. The way his coffee cooled too quickly, the way suits felt like armor, the texture of a well-cut watch band. He began to ask Anna questions that had nothing to do with recovery. He asked how she'd ended up in nursing. He asked if she remembered the name of a soap opera character from a story she'd told. He listened when she spoke about her mother's kitchen and about the tiny city garden she kept on her apartment windowsill. Those were the moments when the line between caregiver and friend grew broader, a legal moat being filled with ordinary days. He was, scientifically, becoming capable of consent. Emotionally, he began to exhibit preferences no longer dictated by breath and reflex. When he smiled at a joke she made about the hospital coffee, the movement felt like an agreement signed in ink no legal document could replicate. There were quieter, more decisive shifts, too. At a follow-up with a neurologist, Dr. Harris presented results that made them all breathe a different kind of air. Scans that showed improved cortical connectivity, tests that suggested consolidation of memory. The sort of technical language that, when translated, meant the brain had rebuilt some of its own small scaffolding. "He's on a very good trajectory," Dr. Harris said privately to Anna. "We need to continue therapy, but he's regained an impressive amount of function." Anna felt the old hum under her ribs again, a softer echo of the first time, and this time she named it to herself. Relief, gratitude, and something more complicated that was not yet fully a word. She kept careful professional boundaries. She signed off on charts, participated in rounds, and never let her compassion become a substitute for formal consent. She taught him to tie his shoes, to feed himself, to brush his teeth without a hand at the back of his head. Every act was both medical and intimate, but now the intimacy had the dignity of reciprocity. Months passed in the iterative seduction of recovery. Grant returned to work in a limited capacity, making carefully curated appearances and delegating the rest. They navigated power imbalances with the deliberate attention of craftsmen restoring a fragile painting. He sought therapy to understand the ways old habits had anesthetized his empathy. She negotiated public life that would no longer reduce her to a trivia paragraph in a tabloid. The legal case against Nathan proceeded, but it no longer carried the intimate terror it had at first. Evidence was marshaled, the mechanic's testimony was delivered with contrition, bank records were entered into the public docket. Nathan's defense tried to spin plausible deniability, but the mapping of funds and a maintenance schedule that didn't exist undercut that narrative. The courtroom was sterile, a fluorescent-proof box that was both relief and exhaustion for those who had to sit in it. Grant attended some hearings, present as a plaintiff and a witness to the fact that he had been intentionally harmed. The moment of Nathan's conviction was not one of flourish. It was a legal conclusion that carried with it real consequences, loss, a sentence that fit the statute for attempted homicide and tampering, a restitution order. When the judge's voice declared the verdict, a room full of people exhaled in varying degrees of relief. For Anna and Grant, it was less an exultation than a quiet mile marker. Justice had been served, and with it a chance to rebuild without the shadow of unanswered violence. Life after conviction was not immediately joyous. Defense attorneys appeal, reputations bleed and then scar. But the particular kind of fear that had inhabited the suite, anxiety about hidden intent, the dread of being loved as a headline, began to ebb. Grant's gratitude matured into admiration. He admired Anna for her integrity and for the way she kept her life outside the hospital. Her apartment with a stubbornly thriving plant, a habit of walking to work when she could, a refusal to be defined only by what she had done for him. One evening, months after Nathan's conviction had settled into the background of their lives, Grant surprised Anna with an invitation she thought was a casual one. He'd rented a small table at a hotel restaurant that overlooked the river. The lights were candlelit, one of the motifs that had threaded through their months together, and the city glittered like a memory polished clean. He arrived with a present, an awkward little box with the corner scuffed, and a look that conveyed that this had been rehearsed in the spaces between therapy and business meetings. He was clearly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with power. He asked a question that had been formed from a place where regret, learning, and desire had blended into courage. "Anna," he said, "I don't want to buy your affection. I want to build a life with you that doesn't depend on me being anyone other than myself. Will you marry me?" The room seemed to pause to allow her the dignity of an answer that would be wholly her own. She thought of the months they had shared, the hand squeezes, the legal appointments, the quiet nights of scrambled eggs and talking about nothing and everything. She thought of the night she'd first felt the hum under her ribs when Dr. Harris checked her pulse, and how that small wave had carried her to this shore. She thought of all the boundaries she had guarded, the ethics she had honored, the slow work of letting love become consented and mutual. "Yes," she said simply, the word like a bell. It landed in the room with a softness that sent both of them into a laughter that contained a little disbelief and a lot of joy. The wedding was small, almost defiantly private. Friends from the hospital attended, therapists who had cheered on tiny victories, a detective who'd smiled at the couple with an adult's approval, a few family members who'd chosen love over scandal. The ceremony was held at dusk in a small courtyard by the river, the skyline a luminous witness. Candles flickered on tables as the night folded its blanket over the city. Grant's vows were not grandiloquent, they were earnest and specific. He swore, not to restore any lost fortune, but to remain present. "I promise to listen," he said, "to fight for honesty, to turn away from the habits that once made me less than I wanted to be. I promise to choose you every day, even on the small days that hide the work of being kind." Anna's vows were a mirror of the same, a pledge rooted in integrity. She promised to hold him accountable, to keep her own life luminous and independent, to love him as a partner, not as someone to be rescued. There was no melodrama. Only the quiet gravity of two people choosing each other after the hard work of becoming fit for a shared life. After the ceremony, they walked along the river under a sky so sharp the city's reflections could not help but look like confessions. Friends toasted them with wine that tasted like celebration. The monitor beeps that had once underpinned late nights were replaced by the casual soundtrack of plates and laughter. Somewhere, the record of justice remained intact, and the narrative of recovery continued its patient course. Years later, when Anna would pass the hospital and glance up at the private suite where a man had first said her name, she would still feel that small, impossible hum under her ribs, not the dizzying hum of the first moment, but a durable chord that had been strung across time. It would remind her of the way small, steady acts had changed a life, the warmth of a cloth, the time spent singing nonsense into a dark room, the courage to follow a transaction that seemed out of place. Grant grew, in ways that had nothing to do with headlines, into someone who preferred presence to performance. He used his fortune to fund programs for trauma victims and to create a hospital wing that bore Anna's quiet stamp, a reading nook, a garden of potted herbs, a policy that prioritized time with patients. His wealth became, slowly, an instrument he wielded not for isolation but for repair. As for Nathan, justice had its own slow geometry. He sat through hearings and the kind of reflection only forced immobility can bring. Whether he found contrition or only the cold consolation of consequence was a private calculus. The law had done its part. The personal reckonings remained his. On a night years removed from the hospital's first flurry, Grant and Anna hosted a small dinner in their apartment. The skyline was a familiar silhouette, the river a constant that had once been a stranger. They ate slowly, tasted new recipes, traded stories about the banal stalemates of domestic life. Outside, life carried on. Traffic, light, the gentle rumor of the city. Inside, there was the ordinary miracle of two people who had chosen to love in a way that honored both their histories and their futures. Grant reached for Anna's hand across the table, fingers finding the scar, if any, left by the years, and squeezed. The old monitor beeps had been replaced by something quieter, the steady sound of a life being lived in full accord. Anna smiled because she remembered the hum that had started it all and because she had learned the value of naming things when they arrived. Trust, justice, a love that had waited for consent to be whole. If this story left you moved, if the idea that quiet care can change a life resonates with you, subscribe for more soul-stirring tales.